Welcome to this first lecture in AP European History. Today's topic will be women in Renaissance Italy. What was it like for women? We're going to start with the Principality of Urbino, and we're going to start there for a specific reason, and that's because the woman you see pictured on the left, Elisabetta Gonzaga, married to the Duke of Urbino, Guidobaldo Montefeltro, in many ways ruled the city, and that's very unique and quite unusual. In fact, one historian, Professor Bartlett of the University of Toronto, has called Urbino a world turned upside down. That is, it was a place that did not fit the normal political and social patterns of its time. And in stark contrast to Urbino, many historians have argued that women, in fact, had no Renaissance at all, and other historians have even argued that women had more power and status in the Middle Ages. For example, a time in which they could own property independently of men. So that's the starting point. So Urbino, we see this wonderful, talented, educated woman, Elisabetta Gonzaga, running a principality, and yet we find that she's the exception that seems to confirm the rule that women didn't seem to have a Renaissance at all. So the purpose of this lecture is going to be looking into the role of women during the Renaissance, in the Italian peninsula in particular, but I think we can expand that to other areas of Europe. And really then, what privileges, what prerogatives, what roles did women play? What could they do versus what they couldn't do? So we're going to get started with this term that some historians have used, and that is women were considered to be the subsidiaries to men. And subsidiary is a term that means dependent, not free actors. And it's a term that's used in the business world, especially when you talk about large corporations where there's a parent corporation that controls or owns smaller corporations underneath it. And that sort of mechanism or logic seems to apply rather well to women in Renaissance Italy, where women really don't have any free agency. They cannot construct themselves as individuals. They cannot participate in public life, either economically or politically or socially. And one must remember, too, that the Catholic Church was also populated by men who controlled all the levers of power within the church. So, simply put, there was no place for women in public life, and therefore the question is, what could women do? So if we move forward to this next slide, we see that women could do several things. One, they could be domestic servants. You see that down in the lower left. They could clean, they could buy food, prepare food, take care of the children, take care of the animals, take care of all sorts of household chores. Women could also enter into convents and dedicate themselves to a life of devotion to God and a religious community within the closed confines of the walls of the convent. And probably the most important thing that women aspired to do, especially in families of great means and wealth and status, was marriage. And marriage led to the idea of bearing children and raising children and taking care of the family affairs, if you will. And the last thing not pictured here that women could and often did, though not by choice, more out of necessity, was prostitution. And it was, ironically, one of the only entrepreneurial paths open to women, though it was seen then as morally depraved, deplorable activity, as I think it is today as well. So that's what women could do, these four things, and that's where we're going to start. So we want to look at, again, when we talk about the Italian peninsula and the idea of the humanists, looking back to the legacy of Greek and Rome and to their lessons, their teachings, and their literature. What do we find with regards to women? Well, sadly, not much. Roman law worked against an active role for women. Women could not own property in ancient times. They could not represent themselves in courts of law. Women depended on men, and in most cases it was a woman's family that made all the important decisions in her life. And in the Renaissance and beyond, as it was in Roman times, the family was a patriarchal institution that is run by males, and any rights or education or privileges that existed for women, and there were occasions where women were educated and did have certain rights beyond the norm, these were provided by the head of the household, that is usually a father, sometimes a grandfather, and it was really the father's own generosity that led to that, nothing to do with the woman's innate abilities or aptitude really at all. So in short, this is a world that was not kind to women, and I believe that traces of the patriarchal world are still visible in some parts of the Mediterranean areas. You can look to areas or states such as Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, territories controlled by ISIS, that still are based in large part on a patriarchal society. And you see there pictured interesting television series, I think from the 1950s. I don't know the name, but Dad is square in the middle and Dad rules the roost. In the right-hand side, you see, on the other hand, a group of Roman praetors, that is, judges debating the finer points of Roman law. And you must remember that men wrote the law, they discussed the law, they enforced the law, etc. So women, simply put, did not figure into any of these areas. So we're going to look at then the fundamental role of women, that is marriage, the highest calling. And that's really an important point, because the family is the bedrock of any society and its social order, and therefore marriage leads to the family, and it was extremely important to preserve and transmit, I think, social values, customs, practices, beliefs, etc., as well as any kind of wealth that a woman could bring to a marriage, was also something like that. So marriage is really, again, the bedrock. It's what keeps society together. It provides order and harmony. And that's not to say love. It provides order and harmony. And again, as I say, humans typically don't like to operate in a state of chaos, and we certainly don't thrive in a state of chaos. So we're going to look into the idea of women and its importance to Renaissance society. Now, in order for a woman, especially a woman of means, to be considered for marriage on the marriage market, and I know that sounds strange, a girl had to possess an unblemished reputation, both physically, morally, and morally. And the standard for girls was extremely high, and there was little margin for error. And I believe that there was a clear double standard here for girls and boys. Boys could do certain things and get away with it, and it was excused. Girls couldn't, and I think to some extent that still exists today in our society. At any rate, one of the most important things for girls prior to marriage was that their virginity be intact, and this was an absolute rule, as a girl's virginity was necessary in order to fetch a higher bride price, and it also protected a family's honor and reputation, which is extremely important in a patriarchal world. So if a girl arrived at marriage not being a virgin, then it reflected badly on the male who ran the household, and something was wrong, and he was seen to be weak or ineffective. So given the high stakes of a girl's purity, girls in families of means were rigorously trained and closely watched and followed. Therefore, you see the picture there, the parents chaperoning two younger people in that large sort of armchair. So that was something that was serious, that existed. Girls were often, or actually not often, never alone with another male, except when girls went to confess their sins in church, and they would be alone in the confessional box with a priest. Now, of course, authors had a great deal of fun with this, and in one in particular, Boccaccio, has a series of tales in which a lecherous priest with lots of libido is going to prey on innocent girls in the confessional booth, and it's a clear violation of the holy laws, theological laws, and morality as well. So, but this is nonetheless the one time a girl could be alone with a man that was not part of her extended family. Now, what about the average age of marriage? Well, according to Professor Bartlett, again, whom I already mentioned, he indicates that the marriage age for girls was 16, 17, possibly 18. And again, this is families with substantial means. Those families where there's not substantial means, peasants, the lower classes of society, we just don't have a lot of records. Historical records don't exist because those in those classes were not literate, and therefore many records haven't been obtained. Though I think that one could look into church records and maybe find some interesting materials even to this day. But that being said, in order to marry, girls not only had to be teenagers, they had to be physically mature, that is, able to bear children, and they had to be mature enough to run a household and be a good companion to a husband. And that is, girls had to possess a sound mind and a good temperament. Husbands, on the other hand, were generally much older. They were well established in life and were in need of both companionship and children to carry on the family name. Yet there's one interesting fact that I think is worth mentioning, and that is forced marriages were not recognized by the church, so consent of both parties was required. Yet, consent may not mean what we think it does today, though consent seems to be an issue that is swirling around college campuses. Oftentimes, girls would be under considerable pressure from their families to enter into marriages even though they may not have wanted to. So in short, girls typically did not get to say no when being offered up in marriage. So the idea of consent is something we should just be aware of that. Now, how do these marriages come about? Well, that's an interesting thing, and I think today one tends to associate marriage as a happy moment based on love and feelings, strong attachments and feelings and romance. But we're going to ask the question, marriage, love versus contract, and I think the answer will be very clear how that worked in the Renaissance. So once a girl was identified as of age to be married, the girl's family would put out word in the community, in the city, state, the town, that they had a girl that was of marriageable age, that is, nubile. And then the men of the town would begin to take stock of the girls of marriageable age. And the men would typically consider or weigh some of the following factors: the level of wealth of the girl's family, the girl's family status, the reputation of the girl's family, the business interests of the girl's father and family, and whether the girl's family was rising in the world or falling in the world. So men are very calculated in looking at certain very quantifiable things as they considered entering into marriage. So once a man identified a girl as a possible match, negotiations between the families began, and in many cases, and this was handled by marriage brokers, consultants that arranged these matches. And it was high stakes. There was a lot that rode on these marriages, so people wanted to hire professional help. And if the initial negotiations proved to be positive, then a serious discussion of the dowry ensued. Now, a dowry is not something that we're terribly familiar with in our society, but it was simply put a bride price, money, land, jewelry, etc., that the girl's family agreed to give to the groom's family in order to encourage men to want to marry their daughters. So it's sort of an incentivization system. And you can see that pictured here, the girl on one side of the scales and money and possessions on the other side. So this is clearly a material calculation. Now, if the dowry was high, then it was a sign that the girl's family had means and was on the way up, and it was easier for that girl to enter into a marriage agreement. If the dowry was low, then it would be more difficult for that girl's family to marry off the girl, and they couldn't be as selective in choosing a husband. So with that, I think that I'm going to stop this lecture here, and if you have any questions, please bring them, jot them down, bring them to class, and I'll pick up with marriage in the subsequent lecture. Thank you very much.